Hi everybody, welcome along to another episode of the Dispatches podcast. My name is Brendan Malone. It is great to be back with you again. And today we have a very, very important conversation with Maryanne Spurdle, who is from the Maxim Institute here in New Zealand. And she has just written an important paper about the issue of euthanasia and assisted suicide, both of which are legal here in New Zealand, highlighting some very serious concerns and considerations. And so she's agreed to come on the show today and just talk a bit more deeply about the paper, about those concerns, and about the issue in general. And it's a public conversation that I think we need to have more of, an issue that's profoundly important but woefully under-discussed. If you like the content that we're producing, then please become a supporter. You can do that in a couple of ways. We've got a patrons page. That's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. I'll post a link in today's show notes. Or you can also support us at the Dispatches on Substack. We've got a Substack page and we publish lots of content on there as well. Both options allow you to provide a regular monetary contribution to help keep the work that we are doing going. A huge thank you to all of our supporters. And as subscribers, you get access obviously to exclusive content, but your support goes well above and beyond that. And we really, really appreciate everything that you are doing to allow us to keep producing this kind of content. In the meantime, please enjoy this very, very important conversation with Maryanne Spurdle from the Maxim Institute. Maryanne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about what I think is a profoundly important topic, and also one that sadly is, I think, woefully under-discussed here in New Zealand. And you are here today because you represent the Maxim Institute and you have just published a brand new paper. And before we get into any of the contents of the paper, I just want to start by saying that I really love the title that you've given this, Interrogating Choice, Euthanasia and the Illusion of Autonomy. And why I like that title is because a lot of people, when they talk about this issue, they tend to go to the secondary question of, well, what are the effects of legalising euthanasia? But really the title of this, and I think what you're getting at in the report too, if I'm understanding what I've read correctly, is that there's a much bigger philosophical question about choice, about autonomy, about really the question of human flourishing that lies at the heart of this issue that we just don't tend to talk about.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Brendan. Yeah, the reason that I'm framing the question that way is because when you get into some of, like you said, the effects of euthanasia, there's broad disagreement. When you ask people, is choice a good thing? Do we want to be able to choose to have the best death possible? Everyone agrees on that. So I'm digging into what makes living and dying good or bad, and what level of choice does this new legislation and the current state of what the Ministry of Health offers us, what's the quality of it? Do we actually have good choices? Does everyone have the same choice? Those are the kind of questions I'm asking.
Yeah, and they're really key, I think, in all of this, because as I said, it can be very easy to hear a very euphemistic and I think dishonest presentation, a very sort of glossed over, it's just about autonomous, self-choosing individuals just making the choices they want to make. And it's so much more than that, right?
Yeah. I mean, the choices we make are very dependent on how good the information we have is. Like if you don't know what a natural death involves, how well informed is your choice? And it's also the options that we have. So, you can give people a choice in the game of Would You Rather, and the choices are all horrible. You have a choice, but is that a good thing? Not everybody in New Zealand has the same choice when it comes to end-of-life care. And the question is that fair? And do people actually have free autonomous choice if they don't have good information and if they don't have good options?
Let's talk a little bit about the New Zealand situation then. So just for those who might be watching from outside of New Zealand, or maybe who are just, despite the fact of having been through what, quote unquote, was a public debate and a referendum on this issue, I still encounter people who just are very unaware of what's actually going on. So just give us a little bit of information about what the current situation is in New Zealand with euthanasia, and perhaps also maybe touch on the recent review, which was a big part of the focus of this particular paper that you've published.
Yeah. So we've had euthanasia legal for 3.5 years. We're one of about 10 countries that have legalized both you take a drug that has been prescribed to you that's lethal, and we've legalized you can opt to have a physician give you a lethal dose of something. Some jurisdictions, like US states, that have legalized it, they only allow that somebody can prescribe you something that's lethal. They haven't legalized the somebody administers it to you option. And in places that have both, more than 90% here opt for that somebody else administers it to you, and that results in a higher uptake. So that's the type of euthanasia we have. To be eligible, you have to have been diagnosed with a terminal condition that will likely kill you within 6 months and be experiencing unbearable suffering. Both of those are actually more vague than you'd expect. Prognoses more than, like 10 or 12 days out, it's very hard to predict how long somebody has left to live. So I've got a friend who was given 6 months to live in 2006. Lung cancer, and he is still alive, and there's a drug that keeps it in check. So it's a very, people given 6 months to live probably will die within the year, but they do not always. Sometimes they live for decades. And then unbearable suffering, very subjective. But that's that. They also have to be mentally able to assent to that. So somebody, say, with advanced dementia, they wouldn't be eligible. What else? You have to have 2 doctors sign you off. If there's any question about your mental capacity, then they can refer you to a psychiatrist for a 3rd evaluation. It's not required. Some places require psychiatric evaluation. We do not have a stand-down period, a call-off period. So the shortest time from application to death here is only 2 days, which raises a whole bunch of other questions. A lot of places have a cooling off period of a couple weeks so that you can go away, think about this decision, see, if there are areas where you need extra care, what your options are. That's not the case here. We've got a particularly swift access. If you're eligible, you can usually access it pretty quickly. Most common time frame is 2 weeks from application to death.
Tell me a little bit about the recent review, though, because that's it's one thing to say, well, we've got this law, and as you've already, and we're going to unpack a little bit of this as we go, you've highlighted that there are some glaring questions here about, shall we say, quote unquote, safety already. But in a sense, I imagine a lot of Kiwis would have thought, oh, well, it's okay, there's going to be these regular review periods, so surely that'll catch anything. Tell us a little bit about that recent review and perhaps how you feel about the review process in general.
Yeah, so the Ministry of Health did a review that said it's largely been operating well. It identified a few things that are vague or not well applied, such as the review committee. What is the review committee's role? Now, original members of the review committee, right before the ministry's review came out, publicly said that they were concerned by what they'd observed. 2 of them, one opted to not renew her contract, the other didn't have her contract renewed. There's only 3 people on the committee, so it ceased to function for a good 7 or 8 months. They look at the death reports after the fact. And both of these former members were saying, there's not sufficient reporting. There were gaps in reporting. When we followed up with doctors, we were finding conflicting information. Came across a case of somebody who didn't speak English, didn't have an interpreter in their consultation, and probably suffered from dementia. How they were euthanized, the committee never found out how there could possibly be informed consent. So there are questions around whether or not everybody who's received euthanasia was actively seeking it. And then you look at the time periods, you look at the reporting, and they had no assurance that there was actually, sufficient attempts to see that people weren't being coerced into it. They're saying if there's wrongdoing, they wouldn't know. If they wouldn't know, we wouldn't know. Now, the ministry's review didn't directly address that. It just talked about those who have oversight roles kind of firming up what their role is. But it didn't seem to advocate for better reporting, better safeguards. In fact, the ministry would like to loosen some of the safeguards. At the moment, doctors aren't supposed to offer euthanasia to eligible patients. And my understanding is that that is because if you have a doctor suggesting that to you, it does suggest that you might be better off dead. And that's not a great way to progress somebody's care when they've got a terminal diagnosis. The Ministry of Health sees this as a consumer rights issue. So they would actually encourage doctors, if the law was changed, to offer it to patients who might be eligible because it's a consumer option. The language is very much around consumers and provision by the state, not so much around patients and healthcare. So it's got a very specific view of how euthanasia should be provided. And it's actually, and ironically, because it's called the End of Life Choice Act, but when it comes to choices, the ministry's review is pretty critical of people who would not actively choose euthanasia. One passage, I'll just read what I put in there, quoting the ministry's report. The ministry's review acknowledges that, quote, some communities' tikanga, customary values, are not aligned with or supportive of assisted dying, and that some held the view that the Wairua spirit belongs to God and the body should be allowed to perish naturally, end quote. And I write, this is an objection shared not just by many Maori, but by a range of faith communities. Trying to normalize a practice that a significant, diverse cross-section of New Zealanders objects to is not the job of the Ministry of Health or any other arm of a democratic government. Rather than honor people's traditions, the ministry's researchers take a paternalistic stance. Regarding Maori whānau who consider euthanasia to be the same as suicide, the ministry writes, this is quoting from their review, this points to a lack of awareness and acceptability of assisted dying within Maori communities and an urgent need for assisted dying to become familiar, understood, and accepted. So this is the view that the review takes.
It's quite strange, isn't it? Because like you've highlighted here, even in what you're saying here in that reply, there are some interesting and glaring inconsistencies. So on the one hand, this is a consumer rights approach that's being taken. And we all know that in that methodology, everything is about satisfying the customer and obviously also, you'd have to say, protection of the customer to a certain degree. You know, the Consumer Guarantees Act, that kind of a way of approaching it. Yet on the other hand, there is this lack of regard for even the most basic of safeguards, which is looking properly at the death reports of people who have died using this process and ensuring that it actually is functioning as they claim it is, which they're claiming it is safe. And that also obviously contravenes the whole modern managerial sort of bureaucratic way of doing things, which is all about reporting. And, you know, every 5 minutes, 20 different people are looking over something. So there seems to be something about this particular practice that really is, there's a deeper issue here, right? That's at play.
Yeah. And if we're going to talk about it in a consumer rights framework, well, one of the options that actually 90% of us are likely to want to access at the end of life is palliative care. Within hospices or palliative care experts within hospitals or in-home care, it is like the gold standard of end-of-life care. It's pain relief, symptom relief, counseling for family after the death. Like, it's walking through the entire process, finding out what is causing not just physical pain, but what is causing people to suffer on every level, and a team of people with expertise meeting that. Palliative care is amazing. I've talked to people, every time I talk to somebody who's had a family member die in hospice care, they only have wonderful, glowing things to say. However, we only have half the palliative care specialists needed. And I know that there are some who would like to go into it, but there aren't the jobs available because there isn't the funding for it. Hospice care, it's not universally accessible. And even what we do have is only half funded by the government, and it's on a very ad hoc basis. So if we want to look at something that the consumers want, this is something that 90% of us will need at the end of our lives. Probably half of Kiwis don't have good access to it. So those Kiwis, euthanasia is fully funded. They have that as a choice. They don't have palliative care as a choice. That doesn't seem like a fair choice.
I want to circle back around and talk about palliative care in a minute, because that was one thing that really stuck out to me just in the executive summary of your report, actually, about the data around how many people are actually even having access to palliative care in New Zealand. But I want to just ask you, if you can, to unpack a statement that you've made in this report that I think is actually quite interesting in this paper. You say this: unlike other options, euthanasia eliminates alternatives. It introduces risks that the normal provision of healthcare, like, for example, access to a cancer treatment or a new diagnostic equipment, does not. Can you unpack that statement a little bit about that idea? Because I think people often just think, oh, it's just another choice. But it's not like other choices that you would actually make that are authentic healthcare. This is a different choice. It's not healthcare per se, and so therefore it does come with different risks. So tell us a little bit about that statement. Unpack it for us.
I mean, it's a terminal choice. For the people who are accessing it within 2 days or within 2 weeks, I mean, if their main pain point is fear, depression, it counts as unbearable suffering. And there is treatment for that. If there's someone who could help them in that area and they don't access it, well, that's a terminal choice. And we don't hear from people who wish that they would change their minds. What we do hear is talking to palliative care specialists all the time. They have patients who feel ready to die, find help in whatever area it is that's troubling them, and then are grateful that there's been somebody to walk alongside them and give them the courage they didn't have, because they're glad to still be alive. They're glad to have met that grandchild. They're glad that they didn't end their life when they felt like it. So we know that with the appropriate care, frequently suicidal patients change their mind. If you're not making sure that patients who are wanting to access euthanasia have all of their needs met first, as far as the system can provide, then that's not a fair choice.
It's kind of interesting to me too, the fact that, as I was thinking and contemplating that statement, I think it's actually really quite profound that you've made there, in the sense that, there's also a whole wider societal implication here that people often don't consider. Euthanasia, we tend to think it's just about an autonomous, self-choosing individual, but in actual fact, they exist in community. And these laws apply to the whole community. And so we are all affected by them. You can't just say, well, if you don't like it, don't have a euthanasia. We're all now burdened by the changes. And I was thinking about the social implications of, for example, if we discover some new miracle cancer drug, that's a great benefit for everyone. There's no downside, in a sense, right? Unless there was some major complication or risk factor with that drug, there's no downside to wider society. The more they hear about it, the better. But even with euthanasia, once it's introduced and you start hearing more about it, and there's a sort of, there can be a compulsion towards it. You've talked about the way even a doctor introducing it to a patient. You don't talk about normal healthcare in that way. It's not a problem if the doctor raises the possibility of a hip replacement operation, for example, or some new drug that they've discovered. But euthanasia, it's a very different category of thing, right? And we need to, I think, get our head around that.
Yes, because it impacts family members and loved ones. And because it implicates people working in healthcare, it also affects hospices, care homes, doctors, nursing staff, and the Ministry of Health's review. This is among the changes it would like to make. It would like to require care facilities to allow it on site or lose their registration. So it is very much behind mandating this in places like rest homes and hospices. Well, at the moment, there's only one hospice in the country that has opted to allow it on site. And I know from people who worked there that as soon as it made that decision, they lost a charge nurse and more than a dozen staff, because a lot of people who go into palliative care, they're not actually signing up to actively end somebody's life. That was not what they went into the job for. And a lot of them don't even want to be working in facilities where that happens. Now, I'm sure that there are people at the ministry who would think they are wrong for having that view, but the reality is, if we mandate facilities, if we mandate healthcare workers to participate, we are going to lose them. And that will be fewer choices for consumers, from the Ministry of Health's perspective. So that, from a healthcare perspective, and then those who don't leave, a lot of them, and this is coming out from the literature overseas, the moral injury that they experience, which is shown in stress and other negatively impacts care as well as the person, we don't want to have people who already have a hard job feeling that they're being compelled to do something that they think is not in their patient's best interest. That's not healthy for them. Then, you move to family members and loved ones. Like I said, talking to people who have family who've died in hospice care, glowing things to say. It's a positive experience as far as death can be. Talking to people who know people who have opted for euthanasia, very mixed feelings. And that's not something we can really quantify, but I think it's part of the conversation.
In your paper, you talk about the risks that are unaddressed by the ministry review. I'd love you to talk a little bit about those, what you think those are. And also, is this a result of the fact that they are taking far too narrow a lens and approach to this, treating it solely as a consumer issue, like you're buying a product or purchasing a service, and therefore the broad spectrum is completely missing. They're not seeing the bigger implications. So that, I guess that's a question in of itself. But then also, what are some of those things that you think are unaddressed?
Yeah, well, the obvious one is that people might not know about all the care options available, or they might not be able to access them. And then you've got the information they do have isn't guaranteed to be infallible, because you have major diagnostic errors. Studies have showed 10 to 15% of the time. There's no way of preventing that. You cannot legislate against it. And then you have, as I said, prognoses, being able to tell how long somebody has left to live or whether there's other treatment available. That's also very hard to get right all of the time. So people are opting to end their lives. And some of them, most certainly are in the final weeks and months of their lives. Not everybody will be. And the checks on that have to do with, some countries require that somebody applying for euthanasia be referred to somebody who's a specialist in their area of need. That's not required here. Any GP who signs onto this can say, yes, you meet the qualifications, and there's no further need for psychiatric care, for counseling, for somebody who's a specialist in that person's disease. They might be missing information. And the ministry's got no interest in extending the process at all. In fact, one of the changes it would like to make is to change that optional third referral so that it doesn't have to be a psychiatrist who signs off that they're mentally competent. So they're trying to speed up the process, which seems crazy, because if 2 weeks is the most frequent time from application to death, and 2 days is the quickest, it doesn't seem like it's too slow. But the ministry, anytime there's a tension between safeguards and ease of access, every single time. And you can see the process of thought, because we considered this option, we considered that option. We're not going to take this option because it would, make it harder for people to access. So we have to go with this one. Every single time it's about ease of access. And the safeguards, so a waiting period, giving a patient 2 weeks to consider, and as some countries do, requiring, Belgium, very liberal laws when it comes to euthanasia. However, they do have in the legislation the intention, at least, that everybody has access to palliative care, and everybody is first referred to a palliative care team to assess what other needs might be met first. And the Ministry of Health here is going the complete opposite direction and removing those kinds of things that would, help pick up coercion, help see if there's some underlying need that the person has that hasn't been addressed.
It seems to me then what we are seeing here really is the underlying and very forceful imposition of liberalism. And you've already talked about the fact that there's not much respect for pre-existing tradition within the community in regards to the moral question, the philosophical questions about death and dying, and now also this approach which would say, well, if you've got a tension between safeguarding and access, it's about access because that's about choice and, well, quote unquote choice. It's about, again, an autonomous person just making the choices that they want to make. And that cooling off period, though, when I read that in your paper that you talk about the fact that the shortest recorded period from application to actual death is 2 days, I mean, that's absolutely astounding. And when you think about that, obviously pro-euthanasia advocates, they're going to paint that in the best light possible. They're always going to say, oh, well, the family had been thinking about it for months or years, or it was the person in the final stages, it was urgent. But what this fails to account for, it seems to me, is the normalization of that speed and the implication of that, where you end up with the potential wrongful killing of people, the potential careless killing of people, the neglectful deaths that all come on the back of a system that just is not genuinely protecting what should be first and most important, which is surely human life.
Yeah. The assumption seems to be, and it's very common with anybody who's strongly pro-euthanasia, bring up the fact that somebody who didn't speak English, didn't have an interpreter, somehow accessed euthanasia. And the response to this is, oh, but there's no proof. Well, you go back to the review committee, the main oversight of what's happened, and they're saying if there's wrongful deaths, we wouldn't know it.
Mm.
That is a concern, that there's no proof because the record keeping isn't there. The safeguards aren't there. And if you go to countries that have pretty liberal euthanasia laws, things that, I think are not operating well, but they at least have some safeguards that we don't hear. And there's at least room to prosecute some of those wrongful deaths because there's better record keeping and better requirements. Whereas here, there's not enough reporting to be able to know if somebody should be prosecuted for the most part.
So I guess if you don't look, you don't find, and therefore you don't have any problems, right? That's what's happening.
Nothing's there. Yeah. No problems.
Tell me, in the paper, you talk about, I think this is another great point that I think everyone needs to understand, is you actually talk about coercion. And I think this is so key because people tend to think, oh, well, what's the problem if, for example, someone called Janice decides that she wants to use this new quote-unquote service and she's autonomous and she's not in a state of mental decline in her mental capacity, there's no one forcibly standing over and saying, Janice, you must die, then that's a free choice, isn't it? But you highlight things like what you call soft coercion, systemic coercion. Talk to us a little bit about the different layers of coercion that's not really being considered at all in the public conversation.
I think we've got so used to seeing the phrase death with dignity that a lot of people don't even question it anymore. There is nothing undignified about a natural death. People can be treated in an undignified way. They can have substandard care. We've seen reports come out recently about especially care homes and how, the elderly are often dying without a good level of care. The answer to that isn't to speed up death. The answer to that is to make sure that everybody is cared for in a dignified way. But there is nothing undignified about a natural death. I read the biography of Lucretia Seals that her husband wrote called Lucretia's Choice by Matt Vickers. And it's astounding. I really loved the book. It's beautifully written. It humanizes her in a way just to see how passionate she was. And it was about legalizing euthanasia. She was suffering from terminal brain cancer, suffering from one of the conditions that's one of the scary ones when it comes to, wanting to access euthanasia because your abilities are just going to be cruelly taken away bit by bit. And so he writes about that. But the fascinating thing about her story is, as it progresses, the theme that it keeps coming back to is that she wanted to remain in control and she wanted to die with dignity. What she was afraid of was ending up in a state that she wouldn't recognize herself in, and she didn't think that she could cope with being incapacitated. Well, as it turned out, she did slowly lose her abilities, and when he writes about her death, he describes her as being dignified, peaceful. She slipped into unconsciousness. He was sitting with her in their house. She had her loved ones there. He was describing the world outside to her, and she slipped away. And as he was watching her, he says specifically that she was not undignified. And he even says that he thought if she did have the choice now, he didn't think she would choose assisted suicide. And this was one of the main campaigners. Wow. That's what natural death like for her. And I mean, there were unpeaceful moments in the interim, and she needed treatment for pain and stuff. But those are things that good palliative care addresses. And I was just struck by the fact that our most famous campaigner for euthanasia died a natural death that was peaceful and dignified, in her husband's words. And that, if you read her biography with an open mind, it just reminds you that a lot of the dialogue we hear around what a good death is and what's being denied people who can't access euthanasia, it's actually a PR campaign. A good death, if you want pain relief, symptom relief in your family around you, that is what people experience in a hospice for the most part.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that's really like what you're describing there, I think at the deeper level, is a form of probably systemic coercion. Here's someone who is living in a culture that doesn't see as much death anymore, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. We've made all sorts of advances. But as a result, one of the downsides is that we are uncertain about death, and we are fearful as a result of that uncertainty, because it is the final journey you will take, and it's pretty daunting, it seems, for a lot of people. And so there's sort of a fear of death that then coerces you without you even realizing it's happening. And then on top of that is the desire for, I guess, control, and that fear of being out of control or being a burden on others. Again, that's a very recent sort of modern societal coercive factor, again, where we live in a culture where we tend to think, even if we don't say it out loud, it's actually not good to be dependent on others. Where in actual fact, traditionally, particularly certainly in the Christian vision of reality, to be dependent upon others is actually a profoundly good thing for not just for you, but also for them and their flourishing. But that coercive pressure is, no, that's a bad thing. And you don't realize all of that's at play when this choice, quote unquote, is before you.
Yeah, we absorb these attitudes that our worth is dependent on our utility, and that our quality of life has to do with, how productive we are, how competent we are. And those are all things that subtly implant fear in us when we face, especially end of life, illness. I don't think that's helpful in this conversation. I think that needs to be spoken about for what it is, for people to make good decisions. There's a really beautiful book by Dr. Catherine Mannix, who's a palliative care specialist in the UK. She's written several books. With the End in Mind is just outstanding. She's been to New Zealand a couple of times. She was here recently, and then when this debate was going on, 6 or so years ago, Maxim actually hosted her to speak. I wasn't working here at the time, and I heard some of her talks, and it really, I found it so helpful, having just walked alongside my grandma in her death and being unsure of what was happening myself, and then having her put words to things and also describe what natural death looks like. It really lifted a weight. And in her stories of walking alongside different personalities with different illnesses and their different needs at the end of life, there were some common themes around giving those people agency, because it doesn't mean that you no longer have control or dignity if you're incapacitated. It just means that your needs change. One of the beautiful things she said was that the human spirit never ceases to amaze her. And she's walked alongside people who say, I would never want to live like that. And as they are helped through these changes in what they're capable of and what they're having to endure, she sees them time and again come around to, okay, they're coping with this new normal. As we all do. We're all stretched and grown in our lives through changes, and we all have to adjust to new identities. That's life, and it doesn't stop at the end of life, and we are capable of adjusting to those things. We just need support. We need somebody to say, what is really wrong here? What is causing you fear or pain? And look, this is what we can do about it. Her presentation of that is really illuminating.
One of the things you've talked about, and I want to come back around because you mentioned it already in our conversation, is the push to remove the restriction on medical practitioners. And I say medical practitioners because obviously it's doctors at the moment, but the reality is there will be an expansion of this like we've seen in other countries, almost certainly, where it'll be nurse practitioners, all sorts of people will be raising it with people. But currently you can't raise it with a patient. You can't say, hey, have you heard about this? Now, that was always going to be one of the first safeguards to fall because, like you've already talked about, in a consumer-based mindset, you can't, in theory, you can't deny a consumer access to all of the information that they are quote unquote entitled to. And so therefore, it's only a matter of time before someone lays an official complaint or a court case says, I was denied this because they never told me. So it seems that was always going to be one of the first to fall. But this is really troubling. I've had medical professionals say to me that they think that this is something they're really worried about because they see in Canada, for example, this being a key factor in why it's just totally out of control in Canada. But it seems this is actually a form of, I don't even know if it's soft coercion, it's even probably more than that, to have the medical expert in the room who knows everything when you're not just, you don't know as much as a patient in most cases, you're also often just been told it's terminal or, you're in a very vulnerable state. And then that person in the position of power drops the seed into your mind that might have not otherwise ever entered into your thinking now. And that's a profound shift. I don't know if we really appreciate just how important that is, do we?
No. One of the stories in Catherine Mannix's book that struck me was she had a patient who had been in the Netherlands, where euthanasia has been legal for a while. I think it was brain cancer. He was terminal. He had just months to live. He had a wife and a young daughter. Every ward round, he was having people remind him that euthanasia was an option for him. Now, for him, he experienced fear because the message he was absorbing was, what you are going to face is worse than death. These professionals think that death is a better option than what's ahead for you. He felt like a coward. He felt like he should be opting for euthanasia to spare his wife and daughter, walking alongside him through the suffering that he was very fearful of. It was really messing him up, and he couldn't get away from people who kept reminding him that, if it gets too hard, this is an option. He literally ran away to the UK where he had family with his wife and daughter, and he ended up spending the last 2 months of his life in hospice care, palliative care, and Catherine Mannix is one of the physicians treating him. And she just described how his life did end, that he was at peace. He'd been really troubled when he was in a place where euthanasia was not just on the table, but suggested to him repeatedly. And the way he ended up dying was in hospice care, with his daughter playing outside. He slipped into unconsciousness and died. So there was nothing, his fears that had been fed by physicians constantly reminding him that he could access euthanasia if he wanted it, those fears were unfounded. He had pain and symptom relief. He had a peaceful end with his wife and daughter around him. He slipped into unconsciousness and died. The way she told that story, I think, highlights the problem of insisting that doctors, especially doctors who think this is not in my patient's best interest, keep providing this consumer choice. That's very simplistic. That's not how choosing medical options works.
It also raises another interesting problem I see. There's already a push in here. You've alluded to institutions. Clearly, they're now sort of gunning for institutions, I think, to be required, regardless, again, of tradition, whether that's an ethnic cultural tradition or a religious tradition, that they would be sort of pushed towards providing it, at least on their facilities. But I can envisage a scenario where you've got a doctor who is dealing with what they see as an extremely vulnerable patient, and they feel, I actually don't think it would be right for me to raise this issue with the patient, but then they're now in a potential legal quandary because if they don't bring it up with the patient, then they can get in real trouble as a result of not bringing it up. But as a result of bringing it up, they then put the vulnerable patient into a state where they make a choice that actually isn't a choice. It was a form of coercion because the doctor has done this, but the doctor themselves, they're bound. Their conscience is stripped out of the equation and they can't really act according to the best interests of their patient in that moment.
Yeah. And one would hope that even if the laws get changed so that doctors are allowed to bring it up, there won't be any compulsion to bring it up. That really would be next level. Some of the literature coming out of Canada from physicians there, where you're free to bring it up, and actually all sorts of patients are eligible. You can be eligible without being terminal if you're suffering for any number of other reasons. And these physicians are highlighting that it's like grinding the gears in a car. So you're treating a patient and you're going, what's best for this patient to live? And then at the same time, if you're considering euthanasia for them, it said it's like slamming the gears from drive into reverse constantly. You cannot operate in both spaces at once well. And it's contributing, to burnout and to other negative effects. That's what we're headed for if we mess with conscientious objection rights.
What are some of the troubling things that you are seeing reported in official documents? You've already alluded to the issue of the Oversight Committee. Clearly, they've raised concerns themselves that they're not actually getting enough information, so that would be concerning. Are there other troubling things? Are you comfortable with the level of scrutiny and also how record keeping is actually going? Because we're now hearing reports that there seem to be also inconsistencies in the data keeping. I'm personally, I just see red flags all over the place. Are there things that you're troubled by? If so, what are they in the official reports and record keeping?
Yeah, I think the fact that there isn't much record keeping is concerning. As you pointed out, I think Family First might have been the ones to raise this. The numbers have been changed. It's like, we've got the numbers wrong. I think we're up to about maybe one person a day being euthanized, and far more people at the Ministry of Health who are tasked with managing euthanasia than with palliative care. I think there are two overseeing palliative care at the ministry, and their jobs were in question recently. So there are enough people on the ground for oversight, and yet the numbers are not being consistently reported correctly. I don't know why. And I think there are a lot of people who are going, we don't know why things are happening or not being reported, or not being recorded accurately. That in itself is concerning. And as I said, when you've got the former members of the review committee saying we wouldn't know if there was wrongdoing, that, until people in that position can say, yep, all the I's are being dotted and the T's crossed, everything that's in the legislation technically is being implemented actually, we've got no assurance that this is actually a safe system.
I've got a couple more questions just to wrap us up today, but before we get into those, palliative care, you've talked about it already. You've mentioned it earlier on in our conversation, but like, how bad is the situation right now in New Zealand? My sense is, as an observer of these things, I remember, I'm thinking this might have been, it would have been 12, 13 years ago, I attended a academic symposium in Australia where papers were being presented by different experts. And even back then, there was a dire warning about what they were calling the grey tsunami, the ageing population that was coming. And not the people themselves, they're not the problem, but the fact that it's going to create an extra burden on resources. And then there's the birth demographic, the lack of births at the other end, which sort of really amplifies that problem. So it seems to me that we're really teetering on a knife edge, and there's no going backwards into sort of more balanced territory in this regard. How bad is it from your sense? What, like, if you could convey to people who are watching or listening, to give them a sense of really grasping the gravity of this issue, how bad is it?
It's really hard to put exact numbers on it because there's different types of palliative care, different levels. So you can have someone in a hospital who has some degree of training in palliative care but isn't a specialist in that area. And so the people they're treating will have, some palliative care support, but they might not have counseling for the families afterwards. They might not have a space for them to have their family around them as they're dying. So there are levels of good palliative care. Really hard to put numbers on. I'd say from the numbers that came out a couple of years ago that said we have half the palliative care specialists that we need, that tells me that we could easily have twice as many in the system right now before everybody has access to it. We know that there aren't hospices in every corner of the country. And hospice funding is, how well can you do advanced planning, these hospices, if your funding is ad hoc year by year and half of their operational costs are dependent on fundraising? So you've got hospice shops, which it costs something to keep them going. So about 40% of what hospices raise go back into fundraising because even though the shops rely a lot on volunteers, they still have overhead. You've got the costs of other fundraising initiatives, and they're reliant on these, businesses and people who just donate. None of that is guaranteed until you've got a government that says this is part of our core services for healthcare. None of those operations can guarantee their future operations. So it's tenuous. And like you said, we've got an aging population. We've got fewer and fewer people who are able to work in those areas. Although talking to somebody who recently trained, recently in the past 15 years to work in palliative care, who had been a GP, she said there are plenty of people who are training in that area, but there aren't the jobs for them. So it could get a lot better right away if there was funding there for that. Now, one of the concerns I have with the legislation change from 3.5 years ago, we're hearing out of Australia, where most of the states have legalized euthanasia, that in some of them, the funding for palliative care and euthanasia is coming out of the same pool. And they're literally increasing funding for euthanasia and decreasing it for palliative care. So we could have a situation, even though, technically we're told they're two different situations. You can have good palliative care and good services for euthanasia, and they can complement each other. But the reality is one of those things is a whole lot cheaper than the other. And the system tends to go for the easiest options, and that is something that is concerning. So I forget even what the question was, but the answer
No,
is...
you've definitely answered how bad is the situation with palliative care. And that's, and people who are listening or watching, this isn't some grand conspiracy. Already for several years now in Canada, they've been producing official government reports. In fact, a specific paper was published a couple of years ago, literally just to highlight how much would be saved in healthcare costs if they expanded the access to euthanasia to more people, because they wouldn't have to pay for their treatment. So it's in a government document. So it's these are market forces at work, right? That's another thing that people don't consider.
Yeah, exactly. There's limited resources, and decisions like that, some people are just going to go, well, let's go for the option that, quote, helps the most people. That doesn't take into account what the best death for those people would be.
Yeah.
What do people actually want? If this is about choice, what do people actually want? Well, 90% of us are going to want access to palliative care. Even if the numbers get to some of the highest international numbers, maybe 4% of us will opt for euthanasia. So, palliative care is and should be the first stop, because that is meeting all of people's needs, not just, ending the sufferer to take care of the suffering.
Let's get to the rub of it now then, Maryanne. What are the recommendations that you're proposing on the back of this important paper, which I really do encourage everyone to read? I'll post a link so people can follow up and read that. But what are the key recommendations that you're making here?
Oh, thank you. To start with, as I said, better information is the key to better choices. And so better information about what end-of-life care options are available, what natural death looks like, just whether that's through hospices, through the hospital network, wherever, just improving people's literacy around end-of-life matters. And then, as we've been talking about, ensuring universal access to palliative care. If we've got universal access to euthanasia, and you've got people who are pro-euthanasia out there saying, actually, this isn't a fair choice. So I think those who are honestly looking at it go, we need universal access to palliative care. There was an editorial recently where the author, who isn't opposed to euthanasia being legal, said we haven't earned the right to offer it because palliative care services are not universal. We need to improve training for healthcare professionals who are offering who have other expertise, so that they are better equipped to help people die well. And it's just an unfortunate reality that none of us like talking about death, even healthcare professionals. And so they're trained to help people live as long as possible, to treat them, to treat conditions. there's minimal training in helping people die well. Now there's no more treatment except to make sure that they're comfortable, that they don't have pain, and all of the other social and psychological things that go along with that. Most medical professionals have not had a lot of training in that. That could be better. And then finally, fortifying the protections around euthanasia. And we've talked about some of those. We need more protections, even if that slows access, because that's the only way we can guarantee that vulnerable people won't be disadvantaged by this law.
One last question. What do you think is a possible path forward? So excellent paper. I'm really grateful to see this conversation in whatever form it takes place in the public square. I think this is a great addition to that. You've made recommendations. We've just heard those. But what is the way forward here? I know, for example, literally in the last few hours in Canada, a new bill has been introduced that would make it impossible which is a step they're trying to make, for euthanasia to be legalised solely on mental health grounds. And so there's a political strategy. You've mentioned palliative care and the funding question. Is it a matter of someone here proposing a church-based, Marae-based model where the state co-funds and the best care is provided that way to fill the gaps? Is it a political thing? Is it a cultural thing? What do you think perhaps is possibly the path forward here? Because it seems our politicians are just obstinately saying, oh, no, it's a settled matter, which I think I find disgraceful, but that's the reality of what we're dealing with at the moment.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
I think all of the above. We've got a few hopeful things. So you've got New Zealand First MP Tanya Onkovich has a bill in the tin that would require Health New Zealand to report on and fund palliative care services. So there'd be some benchmark, some standards set that have to be met so that it's prioritized instead of, as it is now, just, hospices get funding if they get funding. Some years maybe they won't. Actually have targets, have studies, find out how well are we providing palliative care. So if her bill gets pulled, that will be a conversation, and there's the possibility that we could actually legislate some standards around, the positive side, palliative care. What you mentioned around, churches and Marae and charitable institutions stepping in, I mean, that's, for so many things, that's the answer, just people doing positive good in their communities. It's always wonderful when the government legislates and funds something good and it's sorted, but we're not in that situation. So there are some networks, there's some people I've come across who are doing great work, trying, the Hub of Hope, places and just groups of networks of people who are trying to figure out how can we serve people who are facing the end of their life and help them to die well. So there's that. And then I think there needs to be a foot on the brake when it comes to changing the legislation we already have to make access quicker instead of safer, changes that would, impinge on freedom of conscience rights, all of these worrying things that we've talked about. There is a push to change the law in that direction. And I think by having these conversations and by contacting our MPs, we can, bring to light the troublesome aspect of that instead of just taking things at face value and saying, choice is good, we're all autonomous individuals, just, let people have at it.
What would you say the mainstream media, because I know that they have a focus on accountability and there's a question of public responsibility. How could they help perhaps in this regard, do you think?
It's actually been encouraging to see quite a few articles recently highlighting the gaps in palliative care and the failures in aged care. So I think on lack of palliative care for children. So there has been coverage of what's not going well that's keeping this on the map. There's also been articles that kind of, report on people, opting for euthanasia in kind of glowing terms. So I think all of those narratives are out there in the media, but is not just one message, and I think it's good that the full conversation is being had. And I've had some conversations in mainstream media about this, or had people comment on it. And I don't agree with everybody's point of view. I think they've glossed over some things, but the conversations are being had, and I think that's the important thing.
And on that note, because it was a very enjoyable conversation, again, I just want to thank you, Maryanne, for being on the podcast to talk about this paper. And also, I just want to commend you for writing it, and also for the Maxim Institute for publishing it. This is important work that Maxim does, and this is a really key issue. And we need this kind of conversation. So thank you again so much for the paper itself, and also for agreeing to come on today and have the conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Brendan.
Thanks again for tuning in. If you want to support our work, you can do that by becoming a patron at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. The link is in today's show notes. And don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies. And I'll see you next time on The Dispatches.